everyone, great to see you, and thanks for inviting me to this event. I'm exceptionally proud to be invited and part of this really esteemed gathering of people who are agents of change in the Christian communities today. So thank you. And I'm going to talk about ecclesial liberation, some necessary steps. We have a Latin American Pope, not a European one. And he's shifting the church away from Rome and towards the regions. His use of the see, judge, act methodology, employed widely across lay movements in Latin America to offer social analysis of our contemporary problems, such as the ecological crisis and family life in his speeches and writings, is something that I think harks back to his experience in Latin America. And it reflects his desire to avoid abstractions and grand theories, and his preference to ground his teaching in concrete realities and in the personal experiences of the faithful. He took the name of Francis to promote a church of the poor for the poor, a la Leonardo Boff. And like Francis, he's concerned to repair and rebuild God's holy church and effect a gospel-inspired spiritual renewal at every level of church life, from the parish to the diocese, Episcopal Conference, even the Vatican. And he's begun restructuring in order to redistribute power from the dysfunctional curia to the particular churches. This ecclesial rebuilding work is primarily focused on the church's governance structures, beginning with a reimagining of the role of the Pope and an expanded role for the bishops. However, his vision of synodality is directed not only to the bishops, but to all of the faithful people of God and to the church's decision-making processes at local, regional and global level. In short, Pope Francis recognises the urgent need for reform of outdated structures that impede rather than promote the church's mission. So what we have is a multifaceted reform agenda by Pope Francis and his Council of Cardinal Advisors, with its promotion of a more decentralized and consultative model of church under the hermeneutic of synodality. And this involves the shifting of power from the center to the local and regional church context, from the curia to the episcopacy, promoting greater local and regional autonomy and more culturally representative expressions of church. Synodality is Francis's attempt to promote a better functioning church with more adequate governance structures and decision-making processes. But how to foster healthy debate and local variety whilst maintaining unity? Perhaps one of the best hopes for ecclesial liberation is for church communities to take seriously the task of being truly representative of their members. The more that ecclesial communities and their participatory structures engender and reflect the sensus fidei fidelium, the faith sense of the faithful, the more authentic their response to the divine calling to be a people of God, the body of Christ, a fellowship of the Holy Spirit, and the more they're able to nurture the Christian's earthly vocation and advance the mission of the Christian church in the world. We have too few mechanisms to discern authentic manifestations of the sensus fidei. The sensus fidei should suffuse every aspect of the church's life and practice. And as such, it should be visible in and through the church's institutional structures, which should serve to disclose rather than obscure it. Yet it would be difficult to make the case for a commitment to the sensus fidelium in churches that exclude their membership from decision-making processes and that prevent discussion and debate in the church. High-level statements count for naught if their convictions do not capture or echo the resounding voice of the communion of believers. One big reason for procedures in the church and inclusive processes, such as consulting the faithful or communicating teachings, is to ensure that the discernment of the sensus fidelium is given the best possible chance of being identified, because it's not obvious. It cannot be equated with majority opinion in one time or place. Even widely held beliefs in the church were subsequently found to be inhumane and unchristian. So procedures may not guarantee that the sensus fidelium will be correctly identified, but it may improve chances of success. And there's a duty to do everything to ensure this is the case. Well, matters of inclusion, participation, and representation challenge all churches at every level, local, regional, global, and how to give voice to church members, how to promote the full and conscious participation of all, how to encourage lifelong learning in Christian discipleship, how to retain the prophetic character of Christianity, and how to avoid any disconnect between high-level leadership and people in the pews, how to avoid groupthink and managerialism, how to instigate discussion, dialogue, debate, how to reach consensus and avoid factionalism. Who feels excluded? Who's silenced? Whose gifts are wasted? Who walks away and why? Who holds authority and on what basis? How are leaders identified? For the Roman Catholic Church, confronting questions such as these has become an urgent necessity. I'm now going to turn to consider decision-making in the church. And in order to do so, I'm going to draw on the work, not of a theologian, but of John Gaventa, who's written widely about participation and decision-making processes in society. So I'll just talk about that for a short while before getting back to the church. So John Gaventa and his collaborators have created a conceptual tool called the Power Cube to investigate the decision-making fora that exist at local, national, and global level of any social group or organization, in order to understand how power and authority is exercised within them, and how far group members are enabled to participate in such policy arenas, which he calls spaces. And you can see how this might be a useful model for an institution such as one of the Christian denominations, and I'm going to turn a spotlight on Catholicism shortly. Gaventa identifies three types of decision-making spaces: closed spaces, invited spaces, and claimed spaces, or you could alternatively call them created spaces. And he explains that at all levels of society, many decision-making spaces are closed. He says, that is, decisions are made by a set of actors behind closed doors without any pretense of broadening the boundaries of inclusion. Elites, be they bureaucrats, experts, or elected representatives, make decisions and provide services to the people without the need for broader consultation and involvement. Those affected by decisions made in closed spaces put their faith in the office holders and the governance system. They must take on trust that office holders are upright and that correct procedures are followed. Public confidence in the workings of closed spaces is undermined when decision-making processes lack transparency and when office holders are unaccountable to their public. But authorities may choose to invite wider participation in decision-making fora by offering certain individuals opportunities to input into policy-making processes. However, in such invited spaces, those in charge usually retain ultimate control over which individuals are invited to take part, which topics are open for discussion, on which policies are acceptable. On this basis, the leadership can push through or block change. Therefore, decisions made in invited spaces may not represent the views of the wider group membership. And involvement is one thing, but what type of agency do invited members possess? Do they have a voice? Is their role advisory, consultative, deliberative? Are they auditors, listening, where their voice does not equate to influence? Authorities may choose to invite wider participation. Read that. Yeah, beg your pardon. Let's look at created spaces. These are less formal and more fluid than what Gaventa terms claimed or created spaces. And he calls them that because they're claimed by less powerful actors from or against the power holders, or created more autonomously by them. Claimed or created spaces provide alternative participatory fora and serve a range of purposes, including networking, discussion, awareness raising, education, advocacy, campaigning, resistance. And because they're created by the people for the people, they're not subject to the direct control of formal institutions. A claimed or created space may signal the establishment of a new social group, independent of other organisations, or it may function as a parallel space within institutions, established to address particular concerns that are off the agenda in closed and invited spaces. Or they could be a means of internal critique and reform. Having discussed spaces, I now want to say a word about Gaventa's approach to power. And he has three forms of power: visible power, hidden power, and invisible power. And I'm going to talk about each of those now. Various types of power dynamics affect the range and quality of participation and discourse in decision-making spaces. Who's excluded from the policy table? Whose voices have most influence? Which topics are off limits? Gaventa and his collaborators argue that social power operates in three ways: in visible, hidden, and invisible forms. Visible power corresponds to the observable governance mechanisms of the social group, the formal rules, the structures, the authorities, the institutions, the procedures of decision-making. But power may also be hidden from view, operating covertly to influence agendas and outcomes. Hidden forms of power are used by vested interests to maintain their power and privilege by creating barriers to participation, by excluding key issues from the policy arena, or by controlling politics backstage. In the form of incentives or duress, hidden power can influence participant behaviour, such as through self-censorship or self-interested allegiances, and thereby influence policy outcomes. Various strategies are required to overcome the machinations of hidden power. Well, these include strengthening people's voices and capacities to speak out, mobilising and organising to overcome the barriers to participation, or using research and the media to challenge how issues are framed. And Gavanta uses the term invisible power to refer to the profound effects that social and cultural norms, values and ideologies can have on people's identities, their practices, their worldviews. Invisible power affects individuals without them realizing it. Age-old traditions, religious and secular rituals, a sense of order, long-standing notions of in-groups and out-groups, biases, prejudices, are deeply instilled over time and difficult to disinherit. Prevailing norms, values, and ideologies often privilege certain social groups and disadvantage others. The powerful hold that society and culture can exert over individuals' lives can lead disadvantaged individuals to accept unquestioningly their own oppression by powerful others, because they regard this state of affairs as ordained or natural. Furthermore, it can create incentives for those who are socially advantaged to utilize visible and hidden power in order to resist social change. Invisible power perpetuates social injustice, and this is described by Gavanta as follows. I quote, "By influencing how individuals think about their place in the world, this level of power shapes people's beliefs, sense of self, and acceptance of the status quo, even their own superiority or inferiority. Processes of socialization, culture, and ideology perpetuate exclusion and inequality by defining what's normal, acceptable, and safe." Visible, hidden, and invisible power are mutually reinforcing ways that stymie reform of social organisations. Gavanta's threefold analysis of visible, hidden, and invisible power, employed to examine the social effects of power differentials, can also be applied to the ways in which justice is promoted or undermined within social groups. Theologians and ethicists have long discussed the existence of unjust social structures, especially thanks to the liberation theology movement. And they've sought to connect this idea to the concept of social sin, which, although regarded as more than an aggregate of personal sins in the church teaching, has been under-analysed both within official church teaching and also, I think, within the wider academic community. Gavanta's work on power provides a means of better identifying the types of social injustice that characterise all societies, and I think can also be implied within the church as an institution. Visible injustice can be observed within social institutions when policies are overtly discriminatory, such that the system is intentionally designed to produce and promote social inequalities. The resulting winners and losers are those predicted on the basis of the policies in place. Justice can be sought within the system using the existing rules of the game, and possibly through reform of the system. Hidden injustice involves the intentional excluding of people and issues from debate and decision-making fora. Who's at the table and what issues are discussed? The agenda's been set behind the scenes, The rules of the game are not being observed, they're being subverted. The real reasons, self-interest, for instance, that drives people to act the way they do can contribute to this form of injustice. It's a way of mobilizing biases and interests, but this can be exposed by insider whistleblowers who recognize the injustice and misuse of power and authority that's involved. Invisible injustice occurs when the cultural climate has socially conditioned people to accept their lot and to see the status quo as settled and not in need of reform. You could consider social and historical conditioning to fit into this understanding of injustice. But it needs a comparative perspective to expose the injustice, outsiders to look in and call out what's wrong. Perhaps external secular prophets to conscientize the sleeping masses, or provide new knowledge, a new way of understanding reality, a new analysis or paradigm change that reconfigures the old pattern of behaving. And an example might be, for example, women who approve of domestic violence, who perhaps don't identify the way in which they are victimized. The theologian Gregory Baum discusses what he describes as the unconscious, non-voluntary dimension of social sin. He talks about the blindness produced in persons by the dominant culture, blindness that prevents them from recognizing the evil dimension of their social reality. Exploitative institutions are successfully maintained because they're made to appear legitimate to their participants. Even the oppressed learn to look at their social situation through the cultural symbols supplied by the dominant classes. Of course, what's required is a conscientization process. So this hooks in very nicely to liberation theology, social analysis of injustice. I think all of these forms of injustice exist in the Catholic Church, and it can help us identify ways of addressing them. Structures of sin diminish human freedom, and we need liberation from these unjust structures. We need to ask, where are the pockets of injustice in our church? Who are the non-persons? Where are people made to feel like non-members? Why do we fail to deploy the spiritual gifts of so many lay people in the life of the church, and instead allow the spiritual means of production to be held in the hands of so few? Why does one Christian's baptismal identity appear to be worth less than that of others? Can we create some liberating spaces for ecclesial change? My final remarks are in relation to the laity. Lay people are scandalously underutilized as a resource in the life of the Catholic Church. In too many aspects of Roman Catholic life, at local, translocal and universal level, the meaningful involvement of lay people is minimal. Their participation in ecclesial decision-making and governance is virtually non-existent, although the Code of Canon Law authorizes various types of consultative bodies, councils, synods, conferences at local, national and regional level, to which lay people could offer meaningful input. These bodies are rarely mandatory and seldom convened, providing few opportunities for the consultation and participation of laity. Episcopal conferences are effectively closed spaces for laity. Decisions affecting the life of parishes or dioceses may be taken without consulting the majority of those affected. Most of the decision-making in the Catholic Church takes place in what is a closed space, where those appointed make decisions about the good of the Church without the formal input of the faithful. Opportunities for lay involvement in Roman Catholic governance structures could be described as invited spaces, in which a cleric, usually a bishop, opens up what's often a predominantly clerical space to a small and select number of lay people whose invited input goes no further than that of a consultant or an advisor. Parish councils are formed at the discretion of the parish priest, invited space. Diocesan synods are called at the discretion of the bishop, an invited space. On the rare occasions where there's laity involvement in the appointment of parish priests, it's at the discretion of the bishop, an invited space. Diocesan pastoral councils, if they exist, do so at the discretion of the bishop, an invited space. The process for the selection of bishops may involve consulting laity, religious priests, and other bishops. An invited, wholly untransparent space which lacks any accountability. In sum, at the local level, lay participation in ecclesial governance is generally consultative and non-deliberative, whether in parish councils, synods, pastoral councils, or the appointment of bishops and parish priests, and nor are such structures mandatory. At the level of the universal church, the meeting of the synod of bishops, the Pope appoints non-voting delegates, auditors from the ranks of the laity, women religious, and ecumenical observers, an invited space. In other words, lay input to Catholic ecclesial decision-making is highly circumscribed, virtually non-existent. Most lay people play no part in the consultative and deliberative life of their church. Since the 19th century, the church's hierarchical governance model has functioned largely as a closed space where the concern to preserve ecclesial unity and theological coherence has led to an excessively centralized Roman power base. After the Second Vatican Council, against the spirit and letter of the council, that power base was preserved, if not bolstered, in an apparent effort to control content, to portray, if not enforce, uniformity, and to resist change. The supposed collegiality of the bishops has been used as an excuse to rubber stamp Vatican policy. This type of presumed consent has also been used in relation to the people of God as a whole, when docile assent is expected and non-reception of church teaching ignored. Authoritarianism and censorship can quickly follow, where open debate and full participation are denied. At times, Catholic authorities have exerted a totalizing power and control in order to inhibit candid conversation, ban discussion on certain topics, and to suppress opinions that run contrary to church teaching. The history of the Catholic Church is replete with cases where voices of doubt and disagreement have been labelled dissenters and silenced, barred from teaching in Catholic institutions, forbidden to publish their writings, and even forcibly required to publicly recant their conscientiously held beliefs. In a series of small steps, Francis is gradually trying to open up the governance spaces in the direction of more participatory, inclusive, and decentralized processes and a more fit for purpose ecclesiastical infrastructure. But there are still too many closed spaces, too few invited spaces, too few occasional consultative roles for small numbers of select, elite, and powerful laity, the great and the good, where the selection criteria is an aspect of the hidden power that drives decision-making about selection processes in ecclesial governance. The current opportunities, invited spaces, should be transformed into formal spaces of laity participation, and we know that Francis is in the process of doing this. In terms of the lack of deliberative roles, that is, roles with real power and influence in the church, Severino Dianic's observation is striking. He says, apart from the case of religious men and women who elect their superiors and collegially decide upon the rules and programs of their community life, no collegial canonical instance exists in which the faithful, including deacons and priests, have a deliberative vote with respect to the life of their community. Half a century after Vatican II, how can this be the case? To conclude, there are some problems and limitations of the synodal model. the limits of laity participation, that notion of an invited space, the flawed models of consultation. Consultation's wonderful, but it's flawed. There's no proper manner of examining and ensuring a wide range of participation. There's still hidden power involved in selection criteria there. And there's a lack of deliberative role for lay people. Gregory Baum states that it's impossible to avoid the question to what extent the religious, pastoral and theological initiatives of the Catholic people are diminished and controlled by a bureaucratic apparatus that regards itself as the only ordering and decision-making body in the Church, and to what extent the passivity, dependence and submission consequent upon this provokes a sense of frustration or desperation and presupposes many Catholics to opt out of ecclesiastical life, impelling them to leave altogether or turn to psychological withdrawal, despite all verbal assurances and declarations to the contrary offered by the bureaucratic apparatus. And that's his article, Structures of Sin, in a book called The Logic of Solidarity. The second concern about the synodal model is that it's inconceivable that bishops alone could discuss and decide upon certain issues, such as, for example, the role of women in the Church and issues related to the clergy sex abuse crisis, matters that are too important to have the bishops marking their own homework, and two issues there that are surely some of the major challenges for the Catholic Church today. Lay people, who comprise 99% of the global Catholic population, are the key resource in the life of the Church, with the gifts and resources to refresh and revitalize its mission and witness. Their contribution ad intra to the running of the Church, neglected or denied for so long, is now an urgent necessity. There is hope, because lay people today find it relatively easy to claim or create spaces and movements for ecclesial dialogue and change under their own initiative, without the need for ecclesiastical sponsors and without the policing of clerical gatekeepers. These movements can be a liberating force for church renewal. Their education, secular expertise and theological learning can give lay people access to and credibility within the invited spaces that would otherwise be closed to them. And their roles in public life and voices in the public square can speak truth to power, hold office holders to account, and blow the whistle on unjust practices and organizational cover-ups. And perhaps par excellence example of created or claimed spaces are those of the basic ecclesial communities, but perhaps, and my final remark is that there are many others that we can see in the life of the Scottish Catholic Church, and maybe Open House is one of them. Thank you.